Hello, and welcome to another episode of Community Conversations, the podcast for those who have a heart for helping others. In this episode, we welcome Bruce Robertson, an executive pastor at Hope Unlimited Church, who has more than 20 years ministry experience. And also joining us is Nikki Aben, the New South Wales and ACT Coordinator of the Australian Christian Lobby. Today, we're discussing the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill being introduced into the New South Wales Parliament by independent MP Alex Greenwich. We understand this is a complex and controversial topic, and a lot of people hold very strong views about it. Many, perhaps even a majority, of New South Wales citizens support the idea to end their life in consultation with their doctor when and how they choose. But to discuss this topic with our guest is our host Pietro Di Girolamo. Over to you, Pietro.
Hello to all our listeners and a warm welcome to you, Nikki and Bruce. Great that you could join us today as we unpack this highly contentious topic, the New South Wales Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill. It's a bit of a mouthful, which is expected to be read in Parliament sometime next week. How about we just kick off today's podcast with you, Nikki? If you could explain, why is this bill important to the Australian Christian Lobby and what is at the heart of the matter?
Thanks for having me, Pietro. It's a very important issue, obviously, to the Australian Christian Lobby, is because we have always been pro-life. Even before I joined the organisation, the Australian Christian Lobby has always been fighting against bills that I suppose agree with death and making that law and being part of society. We have consulted on numerous occasions that we've consulted with doctors and palliative care nurses and just experts, and how this has been such a damaging law or bill that has passed over in Europe. So we've got places like Belgium or even Oregon in the States, where we've seen them pass this euthanasia bill, and we've seen the devastation that has brought to the countries there. When you have a standard that is compromised, so for example, if the standard of life, and life is no longer sacred, there's no sort of, the door is wide open and you can pretty much approve anything that comes after that. There's no safeguards anymore, which, it's very interesting that Alex Greenwich has promised that this bill that he has a lot of safeguards, but we have seen in other countries that they keep compromising it. So for example, in Belgium now, they're allowing euthanasia for as kids as young as 12. And it's because the reason for it is because they think that their sorrow doesn't have an age barrier. So why is this important to the Australian Christian Lobby? Firstly, because the Word of God says, do not murder, and that life is sacred. And there's various verses that, agree to that. And we want to uphold God's law as much as we can in society. And that's what we're lobbying for. And we have seen in evidences around the country, like I said earlier, about, when euthanasia is approved and how that has left a damaging result. We've already seen it in Victoria. They don't even record when people die because of the voluntary assisted suicide. They don't record those things. And so those things are very much hidden in the agenda. And New South Wales is the last state at the moment that hasn't approved this bill. So it's very important that we push back against it. It was defeated in 2017, and God willing that we would defeat it again in 2021.
Community Conversations is a podcast for those who have a heart for helping others. Bruce, regarding this bill before Parliament, and as the executive pastor of HopeUC, how do you feel you are helping people through your position within the community?
Yeah, it's a great question, Pietro. It's great to also have Nikki, in this conversation, because we're long-term supporters and advocates for all that ACL has done in our broader national and statewide issues. Like the church has largely been, I think, too silent in some of these things. And as a church, we want to be part of a kingdom response and a positive response, we don't want to be known just for what we're against, but for what we stand for. And what we stand for in this particular topic, as we do on most things, is the sanctity of life. If I was to ask my worldview students, for example, what gives you value, it's very hard to derive a sense of value unless you believe that you were designed with a sense of purpose. So, for example, it's virtually impossible to come up with a meaningful moral framework in the world unless you first believe that there is a design that undergirds someone's sense of value. Now, that's offensive to an atheist, for example, but the reality is that faith frames up our sense of worth of the individual. So the church has forever held the sense of value, like the nation of Israel before it did, the sense of value on the human being created in the image of God. And so in every context we work as a church at the moment, for example, we can't meet publicly at the moment, obviously, so we're meeting online. But what we are doing is providing meals of hope and care to every family we can, support of refugees, support of mission overseas, support of aid, and so on all over the world, because we believe passionately in the value of the individual. Now, when we start to talk about the topic of the euthanasia bill, suddenly, Pietro, we're faced with this dilemma, which is that there is a undermining in this bill toward the value of human life. And it's funny because we hear all the time, it's thrown up in these debates, oh, you're talking a slippery slope argument. You're advocating for some sort of, oh, look, if we allow this, then other things will happen. Yep. Well, as Nikki's already mentioned, Europe has demonstrated exactly the fulfillment of all of our worst fears. We are now seeing an epidemic of disastrous, uncaring, assisted deaths where the rights of the individual themselves are being abrogated. And I think we need to be a lot smarter about this naive idea, oh, well, we just trust an individual's choice and a medical choice. Well, I beg to differ. It's on a society to make laws that confer dignity to every member of that society. It's not just the right of an individual to choose their own situation only. We are autonomous, but we're not completely autonomous. So I think that I'm taking a bit of a long route there, but I want you to get that sense of underneath all of this, the church has always advocated for the value of an individual life.
You raise a couple of good points to talk about choice, about the dignity of human life. And that leads me to this next question. We've heard so much in the community recently about these mandatory vaccinations, for example. And the arguments have been, my body, my choice. Bruce, what would you say to a family of a loved one who has been bedridden for months and just wants to die, using the argument of it's my body and therefore it's my choice to make the decision as I see fit?
Well, I have to say, I dislike the my body, my choice argument in any context, let alone in this one. I dislike it for a number of reasons. Firstly, I don't like it in the abortion argument, for example, which is my body, my choice. And I think, well, you're ignoring the reality of other people, other parties, and particularly the interests of the child in the womb. But beyond that, I don't like the argument regarding vaccination either, because I don't think it's a good language to put to this argument. My body, my choice would indicate I'll do whatever I want that feels good to me, but that doesn't take into account our need to also care for the broader community. And so we have this constant interplay of moral frameworks or ethical dilemmas, and we have to navigate them based on what is the best possible outcome for the whole society, but also protecting the rights of the individual. Now, we have enormous sympathy for people that are going through terminal diagnoses and treatments. Obviously, I mean, my mum died of cancer, so I fully understand what it's like to watch a loved one go through that journey. And yet, if she was here right now, she would still advocate against euthanasia, even though she went through such terrible suffering. You know, we can't remove the pain of this. There is enormous pain in all of this. But I want to say, I think there's a risk in advocating just my body, my choice as a very individualized way of looking at this.
Nikki, based on the recent campaigning from your organisation, the Australian Christian Lobby, what has been the community response to this particular issue?
Yeah, we call into our supporters. We don't do cold calls into the community just because we'd never do that to our volunteers. But it's every single time they come back to us, they would always tell us about how this person didn't know about this bill. Now, I can completely understand that because sometimes Christians are just busy folks. And to be very honest, they don't like politics. And they don't read those things because they're probably busy raising their children, doing the job, making sure that there's food on the table. So some people just don't have interest, but yet these very core matters is something that really affects them. So whenever we tell them about this bill, they're quite surprised that it's actually being discussed in Parliament. And then we also give them that option. Would you like to get more information about this, or would you like to be transferred to your local MP to let them know where you stand? The motto of the Australian Christian Lobby is truth made public. There's a scripture that's interesting in the Bible. It says, lack of knowledge brings destruction. And that's exactly what happens. And this is why it's a concerning thing, Pietro, because Alex Greenwich wants to rush this bill. Because the longer that it stays out in the public, the longer that it's being discussed or debated, the more people will know about it and there'll be pushback against it. You can see this in his abortion reform law, that he rushed this, but because of the pushback from the community, more people knew about it. And indeed, I believe that if we had more time, then more churches would have pushed back against this. But that's why I don't believe that this is about compassion, is because if you were really to discuss the matter of life, then you should give it all the time that it needs so that the community will know more about it. So the consensus out there is that many people just don't know about this. And I think that we need to get the word out, which is why these kind of podcasts are very important. Because as much as we can, we have to tell everyone about it because it really does matter to them. And it doesn't matter if you've been a Christian for 1 year or for a very long time. For us Christians, life is sacred.
A lot's happened in the last week in the New South Wales politics arena. Many of us have probably heard about the resignation of the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, and perhaps we haven't yet elected a new Premier, but that may be the Deputy, Dominic Perrottet, who is a strong man of Catholic faith. You mentioned about getting the message out to the listeners. The debate will be forthcoming fairly soon in October. What would you say to people? We have lots and lots of people listening to our podcast, Nikki. What would you say to the people that are like, they are too busy, or they're sitting on the fence, or they don't really want to write to their local member because they're embarrassed? What would you say to them right now if you could be speaking to thousands and thousands of people? What would you tell them?
I would really bring this before the church and those that are calling themselves as Christians, that this is something that we can do and speak up. It doesn't take very long. You actually have a say in the community. Everybody has a voice. And scripture calls us to be salt. It calls us to be light in this world. And for every single one of us, maybe it is intimidating to call your local MP, but you don't need to be an expert in euthanasia or the bill to speak to them. You can simply say that my view doesn't support this bill. And all they'll get from you is a very basic information. Where are you from? Your name and what suburb do you live in? And that's all it takes. It takes a few minutes of your time. And I would even challenge every single one of us, as long as you can vote, that you would raise your voice, that God would find our generation faithful to push back against these evil agendas that will bring deterioration to our society. So because of that bigger picture, then we have to stand up and be brave, even if it is the most uncomfortable thing, even if you've never written to an MP. You don't have to be an expert. You simply just have to use your voice, and that we all have.
So it's basically making a phone call to your local MP. Is it pretty much as simple as that?
It's as simple as that. And if you don't want to, if you can't speak to anyone in the office, leaving a voice message is as powerful. Writing an email that simply says, my name is Nikki Aben, I'm from this suburb, and I want you to go against this bill. That's all they need. And just a reminder to every single one of us that we appoint these ministers to represent our views. It doesn't work the other way around. They're supposed to represent what the community is saying. Therefore, they can't just make decisions without the consent of the public. And if they do that, they fail as in their leadership roles. They represent our voice and we elect them. And so everyone should be calling their MPs if you are against this bill.
Some people might say, look, I'm just one person. Really, what difference can I make? One person. Like, does that actually resonate? Does that transfer to, say, being like 100 people in the community if one person makes a phone call? How do these politicians think, for example? What makes them tick with regards to these phone calls that they might get?
I've heard in conferences that the language of heaven is faith, but in politics, it's all about numbers. One person is one vote, and that can influence another vote. And whether they listen to you or not, that's not the point. The point is that we raise our voice and that we let them know as voters that we want them to go against these bills.
From a time when I worked in aged care, I recall personally caring for a resident who was dying with cancer, and I could see the excruciating pain that this man was in. This man looked at me and he said with these words, which still haunt me to the day, he goes, if I had a dog who was in pain, I would take our dog to the vet and he would be humanly euthanized. And yet I lie here with you folks wiping my bum and I have no dignity of life. And for what? So where is your compassion? Why don't you just give me a needle and let me die with dignity? So how would you respond to this, Bruce, knowing full well from your own experience with your own mother? And have you ever faced a situation other than the personal one that you had with your mum, but in ministry that you might be able to share with our audience?
Well, let's actually, before I respond to all of that, let's define some terms, because euthanasia is already practiced in one form every day in every palliative care or broader context, in the sense that we have what we used to call passive euthanasia, which was literally where somebody would be in a terminal illness and they would either increase for their pain resource, as palliative care, they would increase their morphine and other drug support for them, but ultimately knowing that that morphine itself is potentially lethal. Or in other cases, they wind up, somebody will say, for example, no resuscitation, or I put that as my own living will, if you like. Now, when somebody makes that decision, doctors have an obligation to respect that. The issue is that in that case, the doctor is basically in a safe place, which is that they're acting with responsible and ethical consideration of their Hippocratic oath. They are not overdosing the patient, but they are giving them enough care to ease their suffering, which they also know is going to have a lethality to their actual health. Now, that's a very difficult road for anybody to navigate, but that is legal and appropriate. No, I don't think anybody's questioning that. What we are questioning is where somebody basically is saying, okay, for various reasons, and not all of them to do with terminal illness, and this goes back to what we're seeing overseas and even in Victoria, where we're seeing situations where people are using the euthanasia legality as a way out, as a voluntary assisted suicide thing. It becomes literally, well, I have no terminal illness, but I have a psychiatric challenge, or I'm manic depressive, or, I'm anorexic, or whatever. So suddenly it becomes a thing where I'm going to leverage this, to have I should be entitled to end my life with dignity. Well, where does that is a slippery slope, whether we like it or not. The moment you open that door, I mean, I've worked with so many people over the last 40 years, many of them suicidal. And I can tell you that in their moment of suicidal impulse, the tragedy is that if they find support, they sometimes come through and out the other side. The fact that somebody has a self-harm influence or impulse does not mean that is their permanent state of being. And we know, especially because of the gospel and the power of what Jesus does, we know that somebody can come through these difficult, depressive moments into a place of hope. And that's what I hate about some of this stuff, because it's so final. It's like literally devaluing the value of the person and putting them in a situation where suddenly it's like an impulsive, process of decision-making in a year, for example, where suddenly any other year they might have bounced back.
That's a good point.
My view is we also are going to create a disaster for healthcare workers, because we're putting them in a situation where suddenly they are having to, or almost being forced to, make a choice around certain people's situation to end their life, even without certainty of their own free will. That's scary. That's a scary place.
That's opening up a whole world of a Pandora's box, isn't it, Nikki? I think it's there's a lot going on there. Just before we go to the next question, Nikki, what are your thoughts on what Bruce just shared then?
Yeah, being part of the church, we don't know what the future holds for us. And when a doctor says that you only have this much to live, they don't know the reality of the situation. They're not God. And I've spoken and have many good friends who had loved ones who had been diagnosed of terminally ill diseases, and yet they lived years after they were given that death sentence by the doctors. And it's not because doctors are incompetent, it's because sometimes they do get it wrong. And so when you give that kind of decision to a person that is quite vulnerable and quite hopeless, then you're not protecting them. And I've had many people who, and life is valuable like that. The Bible says that we are relational beings, so it's not just about us. There's so many people that is impacted by our own lives, and that there's so many opportunities there that is unsaid when you just live your life until the Lord calls you home. And I just think that that's not humans to decide. I think that the truth is that life is sacred and everything falls in line with that. It doesn't go the other way around. God upholds life, and so should we.
Nikki, should the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill become law, exactly how does a person end their life? Are there approved medications that are given, and will a family be present when that was to take place?
Yeah, it's really sad, this bill, actually, if you read it. Your heart breaks because it is a substance that is given. So it's medication that is given or sent if you have been approved to be euthanized. And the only thing that happens is if you are allowed to witness it, as long as you're an adult. So there's no sort of safeguards or anything like that. So I'm guessing that they're just preventing from children from witnessing this. Now, the people that can administer this medicine is including health practitioners, which goes against their very ethos of do no harm. This is why they get into medicine, is to save lives. And yet you're training a generation of health practitioners to end life rather than to save it. This very whole thing that we're in a COVID lockdown is so that we can save lives. And yet you've got Alex Greenwich putting out a bill that says, let's end it because suffering is not going to do any good to you. So it's just, I suppose I'm gobsmacked. This bill is really disheartening, and it's heartbreaking because he calls it compassion. But yet when you take your own life and you get sent that medicine, and a health practitioner or whoever is trained could administer that to you, what value does that say about your life? Just that medicine. And the only way out is if you maybe have a change of mind at that point. There are cases in Oregon where these medicines have been administered and people have survived. What's going to happen then when that happens? Humans are very resilient creatures, and sometimes they're stronger than what they think. So how are you going to, what are you going to do when someone just survives that medicine, and they survive for about 20 hours? The gentleman in Oregon, he survived after taking that euthanasia medicine for 20 hours and then eventually died of natural causes anyway. He didn't need to go through that pain. And yet you are educating a generation or training up people so that they can end suffering. But yet you don't know what will happen after that. And you have no idea the kind of evil that can come from this, because people are driven by various kinds of desires. So this bill, they might allow family, certainly not children, and the medication are sent to you. And you get it from a safe box, you get a key for it, and the approval will be as short as 5 business days. So
5 business days. 5 business days. That's incredible. So if a person is suffering some mental health distress at the time and can give a good argument to a medical practitioner, it's horrendous, isn't it, Nikki?
It's too short, Pietro. How can you value a life in 5 short days? I've worked with young people who wanted to take their lives, and it took longer than 5 days to counsel them out of that, to remind them that their lives are valuable. How can you just put that of a short of a time frame? And when you are compared to, as a former deputy premier says, that we are likened to animals, I beg to differ. I think that we are much, much more valuable than animals, and you can't just euthanize us because, we're the same level as dogs. But yeah, when I work with young people who have very, suicidal thoughts, it takes longer than 5 days. Sometimes it takes years, week in and week out, counseling them and reminding them, because they are valuable. And Alex Greenwich thinks that your life is, as valuable as 5 business days. It's almost like you're some sort of business that you can be removed from society.
I just want to make some comments now about palliative care. We know that it's grossly underfunded in regional parts of Australia. But the following information comes from the Dying with Dignity website. I just want to read it out to you. Palliative care, the central credo of palliative care is, we shall neither prolong nor hasten death. And then deep continuous palliative or terminal sedation, the gradual titration increase, and hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, by continuous infusion of sedatives and analgesics, usually without the provision of food and liquids and fluids, until the patient enters a coma and remains so until death occurs. It is generally considered a treatment of last resort when a patient's pain and suffering can no longer be controlled. According to Dr. Rodney Syme on the 26th of May 2015, quote, terminal sedation is used in exactly those circumstances where other doctors might provide assisted dying if they were asked. And that's a lot of information there. This sounds like what I've heard many patients in palliative care say. So would it be fair to say that to some degree, patients are getting their wishes anyway?
If I was to sum up, for example, my responses, including palliative care, it would be this. We've already mentioned the sanctity of life, the importance of the sanctity of life, that if God, for example, gave us life, then it's a gift of God that he gave to us. And technically, we in some way are accountable back to him. And that's worth thinking about. The Christian is always thinking about the eternal implications of any decision making, not just what happens in this life. Now, the atheist could respond by saying, well, we don't care about that. We don't even believe it. I go, well, that's fine, but that's still a belief. It's you've got a faith, I've got a faith. We both have a different belief, but still we have to navigate practically how to make this work. And the truth is, you can't properly regulate euthanasia. You see, palliative care, and I've been in many palliative care settings over my ministry life and witnessed incredible suffering, but also incredible courage and beauty in those moments of terminal illness. And it's not, there are many around me who are much better in that space than I am, but I can tell you that I have the utmost respect for those who care for the dying. And I think to put them in a situation where suddenly we're saying, oh, look, can you please actively take their life when they have worked constantly to protect their life and to heal their life or to make their life better is like, you're making a medical practitioner schizophrenic to do that. You're literally going, as Nikki said, do no harm, except now, please harm. please go ahead and harm. And in the middle of that, there are other people affected. As you all know, like the families that are tied around this moment of death, we think it's the worst thing in the world, but actually it's not. It's technically and spiritually one of the most important and powerful things. You know, this is an alarming statistic, Pietro, but 100% of Australians die. We are all suffering from chronic death syndrome, you know, and I'm a bit like Woody Allen. I feel like, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. You know, somebody asked me the other day, what do you want people to say at your funeral? I said, look, he's breathing. I think we have these moments where we are literally, confronted with, as Nikki sort of clearly said, an emotional moment where you could say, yes, my will is I don't want to continue my life. And within 5 days, you might change your mind, but good luck with that. I think my mum was given a terminal diagnosis of a particular cancer 30 years before she died.
Wow.
And she died of a completely different thing,
wow, that's amazing.
At a very ripe old age. And I can tell you that if she had allowed that doctor's diagnosis to dictate her response to life, she would have died within that 6-month period that he initially prescribed.
It's an interesting...
We have to acknowledge that miracles do happen, that things change, and that even in this, there are many, many examples around the world where people have literally decided at the last second, actually, I don't want to be euthanized.
You know what, though, Bruce, which is interesting, and in my experience, when I have had some experience in aged care, is that because of the lack of palliative care for some people, is that they feel like they're a burden to the family, which can lead to some people dying, sooner than they really need to, because they feel like their families abandoned them and what's the point of living? So, Nikki, I do want to give you the opportunity, as Bruce has just shared on that regarding palliative care, but what are your thoughts around that discussion we've just had on palliative care, and what do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, and I suppose my input to this is just a short one, because statistics show, or research show, that most people, they want to end their life because of fear of suffering, or fear that they'll be a burden to their families. And good palliative care actually will alleviate that. It will alleviate those fears and assure them that they don't have to go through that pain. And the government can afford to invest more money on palliative care. They can spend money on apps that will cost millions of dollars and will only last for a few months. Then surely good funding, and making sure that this funding is actually being provided to these regional hospitals. Let's keep our leaders accountable. And if you've got budgets for these palliative care, why don't we make sure that actually happens, and that making sure that we are looking after individuals in our communities. And just because statistics show that, they're scared, people are scared. And I think that, as a Western civilization, we can afford these things, and we can make sure that these things are applied in all of our government hospitals, and indeed even our private hospitals as well. So,
Bruce, I've heard you say, very tongue-in-cheek though, where there's a will and testament, there's a family. But seriously, one of the concerns is that this bill doesn't just offer a legal way to die, but it could also offer a legal way to commit murder. When the person or people, usually family, are pushing for the end of life of a loved one, it opens up a whole can of worms.
There's two aspects to that. One is that it might seem like, oh no family would do that. Well, I beg to differ. There's very clear evidence that has already taken place, particularly in Europe. And one case I read where the family literally had to hold the unwilling euthanasia person down, even though they had previously said they want to be euthanized. When it came to the crunch, they resisted, and because of their state of dementia, their own will was overruled, and the family were forced to hold them down while they were injected. Now, to me, that is beyond mind-boggling. And what medical practitioner can hold to their Hippocratic oath and actually fulfill that particular scenario?
Yeah.
And you know, if it was just a one-off, you go, well, that's just a random case. Well, that's an extreme case, but there are many cases. You know, I mean, I urge people to do their own research on this stuff, because it's all, you know, Mr. Greenwich's bill seems all, you know, like, oh, it's all compassionate. I go, rubbish. It's not compassionate. It's a pseudo compassion, actually, is how I would describe it. It basically, as I said before, undermines sanctity of life. It puts people at risk. It creates a slippery slope where we can't define, well, of what makes a life valuable. Are we going to then say that people with special needs are less valuable? Someone with dementia is less valuable? Someone above a certain age is less valuable? Someone who doesn't have the same motor skills is less valuable? What the heck? Like, you know, the moment you mess with sanctity of life, you are messing with the fundamental basis of all human value. And that's why I say, like, you just can't open the door to this rubbish, really. Like, the moment you do, it's like, where do you end?
Very, very good answer. Thank you, Bruce. The Bible was written a long time ago, and both of you know the Bible well. And one of the commandments is simply this: thou shalt not kill. Surely there must be exemptions to this, and especially on compassionate grounds. Let's just call it euthanasia. How relevant is the Bible, given that it was written a long, long time ago? And surely God would not consider euthanasia as a sin. I welcome a response from both of you on this. Nikki, over to you first.
Yeah, so murder is when you intentionally take life. And that's what euthanasia is. It's to snuff it out before God, you know, says that his life is finished, or when God calls us home. And in that comment where the Bible is written a very long time ago, this is who we are as Christians. And if many more Christians lived out the Bible and actually read it, and then just not know it, but actually live by it, then we would be a witness to this country that God's ways are better, God's ways are higher, and they truly value human life. So is the Bible irrelevant today? No, I don't think so. It was written thousands of years ago, but it still is a bedrock of very strong societies. It is a bedrock of the church, and it is witness in itself that it does work. And when time passes and I'm no longer in this world, I believe that the Bible will still be as relevant. Truth surpasses time. It always will, because no matter what happens, the wind will blow and, you know, flower will fade tomorrow, but the Bible and the truth will always stand forever. So I think that what Scripture says is very important especially to us as Christians. And it's very interesting that the Bible in the Old Testament was given to the Israelites because it distinguishes them from the rest of the world, because it distinguishes them to be God's people. And that's why for Christians, it is who we are. This is our character. These are our principles. And this is why for ACL, for the Australian Christian Lobby, we need to uphold God's words. So, yeah.
There is this fundamental problem in Western society at the moment, which is that we pretend to believe in relative ethics. But C.S. Lewis has already demonstrated in his book, The Abolition of Man, that the idea of relative ethics is actually a logical impossibility. You can't have relative ethics without an absolute that undergirds them. And I want to quote from two of my other heroes. Stanley Grenz says this about ethics: ethics is theology in action. So in other words, my ethical framework, my worldview, my moral compass demonstrates what I believe about God, about the world, and particularly about people. So if you don't have an ethical framework that believes in the sanctity of life, well, of course, you can regard some people as disposable. But let me quote to you from another hero, Tim Keller. He writes these words. He says this: though we have been taught that all moral values are relative to individuals and cultures, we can't live like that. In actual practice, we inevitably treat some principles as absolute standards by which we judge the behaviour of those who don't share our values. What gives us the right to do that if all moral beliefs are relative? Nothing gives us the right. Yet we can't stop it. People who laugh at the claim that there is a transcendent moral order do not think that racial genocide is just impractical or self-defeating, but that it is wrong. They think it's wrong. They think certain things are wrong. The Nazis who exterminated Jews may have claimed that they didn't feel it was immoral at all. We don't care, he says. We don't care if they sincerely felt they were doing a service to humanity. They ought not to have done it. We do not only have moral feelings, but we have an ineradicable belief that moral standards exist outside of us by which our internal moral feelings are evaluated. Why, he says, why do we think these moral standards exist? Let me finish with this point on that topic. Euthanasia, where it becomes active, and as Nikki pointed out, it becomes not just thou shalt not kill, it becomes thou shalt not commit murder. When we compel a medical doctor to commit murder, or another practitioner, or even a family member, there is no way for knowing definitely that person at that last second is absolutely a willing participant. Now you can argue, well, let them inject themselves, let them push their own button, let them do whatever it takes. But even at that moment, there's no way of knowing what might have happened if they did not do that. And that is part of my dilemma, because I have watched so many people change in things that you would swear they could never change. I've watched them overcome addictions and depressions and anxieties and things that you would have sworn would control and kill them, but they didn't. And that is the power of hope, but it's also the power of ethics, of good ethics, and it's the power of the divine value that God placed on each of us. When someone twigs to that, when they discover who they really can be, even in the midst of a terminal illness, then it's worth it. Let's use a classic case in point. Everybody watched the amazing Nightbird come on America's Got Talent a few months ago. And you know, she'd been given a 2% chance of life, basically, due to her cancer diagnosis. And she had suffered. I mean, I read her story, and she had suffered unbelievably in the year leading up to that performance. And I guarantee many times she wanted her life to end, and it didn't end. And I promise you, she probably wished at moments that it had. But I guarantee that if you were to speak to her right now in terms of what had happened since, she would say, it's been worth it for me to bring hope to the world. She became literally on one day the biggest selling artist in the world overnight because of one song, which was It's Okay. And I think she says it more eloquently than I ever could about how to deal with, you know, something as horrific as a terminal illness as a young person even. And so for me, it's like, they're the stories I want to celebrate, not the stories of how someone ended their life prematurely.
You offer some very good answers here, Bruce, about giving us hope and the divine value that God's given to us, and we can discover who we are. Given your great understanding of both politics and ministry, this question is around politics for you, Bruce. We've heard in the past that politics actually has no place in the church, that ministers like you should actually just preach what's in the Bible and the rest of it you can just keep quiet. Since there's no reference in the Bible about assisted dying or euthanasia, is it best to keep quiet about these contentious issues like the ones that we've had in the past that we've all known about? Does it come down to a matter of conscience, similar to whether a person accepts or declines a vaccine, for example, because that's the topic of today? Can you give us a short answer on that one, please, Bruce?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm capable of short answers typically, but I'll endeavour to be quick. Look, my view is this. I don't primarily advocate a political standpoint. I doubt whether my church really knows who I would even vote for. And I've deliberately kept that to myself. However, I'm urging every Christian to be politically involved, not because they're a Christian, because they're a citizen. And what I hate about what has happened in Australian society and Western society generally is that it became this idea that, oh, because you're a Christian, you're not allowed to bring your faith to public. You must keep your faith personal and private. Oh, yes, let's box those people of faith in. And I go, really? Last time I read the Constitution, you are entitled to publicly proclaim your faith without any hindrance. And you know, the reality is that we have marginalized the Christian voice out of the political sphere. Meanwhile, an atheist who has no more reason to believe, their belief is less fact-based than the Christians, and yet they're allowed to push their ridiculous agenda over the whole of the community because, it's not a religion. It is a religion. Atheism is absolutely a religion. And so I would say, you know, if you're entitled to bring your atheistic faith, I'm going to bring my faith to every political sphere I can. Sorry, that wasn't that short an answer, but anyway, my rant is over.
The Australian Christian Lobby has run many campaigns in the past, effectively against the same person, independent MP Alex Greenwich, who introduced the Say No to Same-Sex Marriage, and then the Abortion Law Reform Act. We know that many Christians voted for the same-sex legislation, and there was unanimous support in the chamber for the abortion bill. What chance realistically does the ACL or the Christian community have getting this bill rejected? Nikki, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, realistically, and I always bring this before our volunteers, that this is an uphill battle. But according to our records, you know, New South Wales probably has the best chance, perhaps, to defeating this bill. But regardless of the result, it doesn't matter. You know, we don't know how this holds. Like the last few days for the New South Wales government has been quite surprising. You know, we're now about to meet a new premier. So we don't know what the future holds, but we do know that today we are called to be faithful. And that faithfulness includes us raising our voices to stand up for life. So whether this is an uphill battle, whether this is something that we're going to lose, whether the abortion bill was approved back in 2019, even if actually on that point, even if the abortion bill was defeated, there was some significant amendments that was put forward. And that's because people rallied and raised their voice. And that set a standard, a precedent, you know, for South Australia to bring in even stronger amendments. And our former national politics director, he was a former MP in Canberra, and he says that bills can always change. And so that's why this fight is, you know, for the rest of our lives. Whether this bill gets approved, if it gets rejected, fantastic. If it gets passed, then we will continue fighting against these things, and we will continue raising our voices, because we don't know, and someone is listening, and there are MPs that are being told, you know, that the community doesn't support this. So we have to be faithful at this, and the result we leave to God.
Bruce, as a Minister of Religion, these bills introduced by MP Alex Greenwich challenge the biblical position that many churchgoers have. It might appear that Minister Greenwich is taking on God, and partway through the game, it looks like the minister might be in front. So what place do you think politics have in church?
Look, I can tell you as a former senior pastor of a church that we had people that voted for every different major political party in our congregation. And I love that. That never worried me. I think what I wanted them to do was to engage with issues properly and to debate them and to think out loud. And one of my pet hates at the moment is the way we silence debate, the way we stop logical debate and healthy dialogue between people. I mean, I fight with people all over the world, all the time about all sorts of issues. That doesn't mean I don't care about them, and they care about me. I mean, most people, used to be able to engage rationally in discussion and debate. Now, I would rather debate ideas and keep the relationship rather than cancel a person just because their worldview doesn't fit up with mine. So I have lots of friends who are atheists, lots of friends who are, very incongruent to my lifestyle and my belief system. But the bottom line is that Nikki's exactly right. We don't have the right to stay silent. We are actually, in addition to being Christians, we're also citizens of a community. And we have a moral obligation to raise our voice and our perspective into that context. If we don't, then we deserve the outcome. And that's the tragedy of what we've seen over lots of issues over the last 30 or 40 years is the silence of the Christians who probably had a better perspective, but they never spoke up because they would go, oh, it's not out, we're not involved in politics. I go, well, that's why we have some of the terrible political outcomes we have, because we abdicated. So I'm cheering on Australian Christian Lobby and Christian politicians and people of faith generally that are taking a stand. And there are lots of people of faith in the political community, but one of the reasons they don't bring it to the fore is because it's so flipping hard, because they've been absolutely smashed for doing it. If the Christians would endorse them more, I think we'd see a better outcome. And that's on all sides of politics.
Thank you, Bruce. Finally, what would each of you like to say to those politicians in the New South Wales Parliament who are still undecided regarding this Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill? And secondly, what encouragement would you give to the members of the public, and how can they actually make a difference?
Yeah, very quickly, I suppose with the New South Wales Parliament leaders, please look at the results that's happening right across, the continent, in Belgium and Switzerland, and the results that's happening there in Oregon, and just do your thorough research. And to the community, especially the Christian community, it just takes courage, and courage doesn't mean that you're not without fear, but it does mean that you're going to do the right thing, even if you are going to get some backlash. We all have voices, so I would encourage every single person who is against euthanasia to call their MPs and contact all their members of the community and tell them to do the same thing. Like, I believe that together we can see some significant changes in this state.
I guess two things. The first would be to any MP that's undecided on this thing, I would say err on the side of caution, because we voted this down back in 2017 in our New South Wales Parliament for exactly the same reasons. And rightly, we did it rightly. And I would urge them to hold the ground that they held on that time. This shouldn't actually, Gladys Berejiklian rightly pointed out, this shouldn't be coming back to Parliament because it had already been resolved. So let's err on the side of caution. The second thing is, if you're going to invest in anything in this process, invest in life. Invest in life. Let's provide better palliative care. And a lot of this argument is removed. Like if we have every regional community with really strong palliative care, end of life scenarios become incredibly therapeutic, incredibly healing for families, incredibly holistic, and suffering, as much as we hate the suffering, we recognize that that's not the only part of the story. Every one of us dies. But let's not assist people to die before their time.
Fantastic. That is brilliant. I just would like to invite our listeners to share, like, and comment. Let's get this message out to everyone. I mean, most of us know at least 10 or 15 people through our social media pages at least. We can use the old traditional sending people SMS messages. This is a podcast that really resonates with the community at large. As Bruce has shared, whether you're an atheist or you're not, or a Christian, it doesn't matter who you are, we're a human being. Let's champion life. Life has value. So for me, that's a wrap, folks. It's been a big topic and we've only scratched the surface. But whatever your position, Community Conversations is a podcast for those who have a heart for helping others. I hope this episode has helped you in some way and that you feel more informed. If there's anything about what you've heard today, especially, and it's caused you some distress, can I just encourage everyone to ring Lifeline? They're open 24 hours a day. The number is 13-114. To our very special guests who have a heart for helping others, thank you so much, Nikki Aben, and also Bruce Robertson for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our executive producer, Michael Smith, and I'm your host, Pietro Di Girolamo. Thank you for listening. Have a great day and be kind to each other.